The mountains swallowed them in silence. Under the snow, life was slipping away, and only seconds stood between survival and tragedy. Aspen, Colorado. The morning began bright, with snowboarders carving paths into untouched slopes, but the beauty of the Rockies can turn merciless in an instant. A thunderous crack echoed across the mountainside, and tons of snow thundered down, burying riders in its icy grip. In minutes, the mountain rescue team was airborne, a dog barking in the helicopter cabin, shovels and probes ready. Every rescuer knew the clock had already started ticking. And before I tell you what happened next, if you believe stories of courage should be told, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because what follows is a race between life and death, where every second counted. The sun painted the Rocky Mountains in golden hues as Jake Martinez adjusted his snow goggles and gazed down the pristine slope that stretched before him like an uncharted ocean of powder. At 24, he lived for mornings like this. Powder snow untouched by crowds, the crisp Colorado air filling his lungs with the kind of purity that could only be found at 11,000 feet above sea level, and the freedom that only the backcountry could offer. His custom snowboard gleamed under the morning light, its edges sharp and ready for what seemed like another perfect run down Aspen's legendary terrain. The backcountry area they had chosen was a local secret, known only to experienced riders who were willing to hike for over an hour through knee-deep snow to reach the pristine slopes that lay beyond the resort boundaries. No groomed trails here, no safety patrols, no crowds of tourists, just raw mountain wilderness in all its magnificent and dangerous beauty. "This is it, man," shouted his friend Connor Walsh from behind, strapping his boots into his own bindings with practiced efficiency. "Look at this powder. We've got the whole mountain to ourselves." His breath created clouds of vapor in the frigid air as he laughed, the sound echoing across the pristine wilderness. Connor was 25, a software engineer from Denver, who had moved to Colorado specifically for moments like this. 3 other snowboarders in their group shared the excitement, their voices carrying across the mountain silence as they prepared for their descent. Marcus Chen, a 27-year-old photographer who documented extreme sports, was adjusting his helmet camera to capture the epic run ahead. Danny Peterson, fresh out of college and working his first season as a ski instructor, couldn't contain his enthusiasm as he surveyed the untouched terrain. And Tyler Morrison, 26 and a recent law school graduate, had driven up from Denver specifically for this adventure. They had all met through Colorado's tight-knit snowboarding community, bonded by their shared love for powder and their willingness to venture beyond the safety of groomed slopes. Today was supposed to be the culmination of weeks of planning, waiting for the perfect combination of fresh snowfall and stable weather conditions. Jake pushed off first, carving his initial turn into virgin snow so light and deep it felt like floating on clouds. The sensation was pure magic, his board slicing through powder that sprayed up around him like liquid silk catching the morning sunlight. Behind him, his friends followed in a loose formation, each rider painting their own signature line down the mountainside, their tracks creating the first human marks on this pristine canvas. The snow sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun, and the only sounds were the gentle swish of boards cutting through powder and the distant call of wind through the towering pine trees that lined the slope. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks piercing a brilliant blue sky that seemed to go on forever. None of them noticed the subtle signs that experienced mountaineers would have recognized immediately. The recent heavy snowfall over the past week had created unstable layers deep within the snowpack. New snow sitting uneasily on older, weaker layers that hadn't properly bonded. The warming morning sun was beginning to affect the snow's crystal structure, adding just enough heat to create instability. And the slope they were riding, steep, open, and loaded with several feet of fresh snow, was textbook avalanche terrain, that should have triggered every warning instinct they possessed, but they were young, skilled, and intoxicated by the beauty of the morning. Jake carved another turn, sending up a spray of powder that caught the sunlight like glitter. For a moment, he felt like he was living in a dream, suspended between earth and sky in a world of infinite white beauty. Dreams, however, can shatter in an instant. As Jake leaned into his next turn, carving a graceful arc through the pristine powder, he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A sound like distant thunder, deep and rumbling, growing louder with each passing second. It was a sound that every backcountry rider fears above all others, the voice of the mountain itself awakening in anger. He looked up the slope and saw what would haunt his dreams for years to come. A fracture line spreading across the snow above them like a massive crack in glass, racing horizontally across the mountainside with terrifying speed. The crack was hundreds of feet wide, and behind it, an entire slab of snow, easily 6 feet thick and covering acres of mountainside, began to settle and slide with the inevitability of gravity itself. Avalanche! Jake's scream pierced the mountain air, his voice cracking with terror and desperation. But the warning came too late. The mountain had already made its decision, and physics would not be denied. Above them, thousands of tons of snow began their deadly descent, accelerating with each passing second into an unstoppable force of nature. Jake pointed his board straight downhill, desperately trying to outrun the approaching wall of white death that was bearing down on them like a freight train made of ice and snow. His friends scattered in different directions, some trying to traverse to safety toward the trees, others following Jake's lead and racing the slide down the mountain in a futile attempt to stay ahead of the chaos. The avalanche moved with impossible speed, starting as a relatively slow slide, but quickly accelerating to speeds of over 60 miles per hour. What had begun as a simple slope failure became a churning, roiling mass of snow, ice, rocks, and broken trees that consumed everything in its path with indiscriminate hunger. Connor, who had been closest to the fracture line when it released, was the first to disappear. Jake caught a glimpse of his friend carving hard to the left, trying desperately to escape the slide zone and reach the safety of the trees. For a moment, it looked like Connor might make it. His board was fast, his technique flawless, but the avalanche was faster. One moment Connor was there, his red jacket a bright splash of color against the white slope, and the next, he was gone, swallowed by tons of moving snow as if he had never existed at all. His terrified scream cut off abruptly as the avalanche engulfed him completely. Jake felt the leading edge of the slide catch his tail, and suddenly he was no longer riding snow, but being ridden by it. The world became a chaos of white and grey, up and down losing all meaning as he was tossed like a rag doll in a washing machine made of ice and rock. The violence was beyond anything he could have imagined. Bones should have broken, organs should have ruptured, but somehow he remained conscious as the mountain carried him in its grip. Marcus and Danny, who had been riding in the middle of the group, vanished beneath the surface almost simultaneously. Jake caught a flash of Marcus's bright blue jacket and Danny's distinctive yellow helmet, and then they too were gone, swallowed by the relentless white that seemed to have no bottom and no mercy. In desperation, Jake managed to reach the cord for his avalanche airbag backpack, pulling it just as the slide swept over him completely. The airbag deployed with a loud pop, inflating to the size of a large balloon behind his head. The physics were simple but crucial. Larger objects tend to rise to the surface in flowing debris, and the airbag made Jake effectively larger, helping to keep him near the surface as thousands of tons of snow carried him down the mountainside. The avalanche thundered down the slope for what felt like an eternity, but lasted only 90 seconds. Trees snapped like toothpicks, their trunks splintering with sounds like gunshots. Boulders the size of small cars tumbled within the flow, grinding against each other with a noise like breaking bones. The air itself seemed to scream as it was compressed and displaced by the moving mass. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The roar faded to an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. The mountains settled into stillness, as if the violence of the past minute and a half had been nothing more than a brief, angry breath. Jake found himself buried up to his chest, his head and shoulders above the debris field. His airbag had saved his life, keeping him near the surface when he should have been crushed and buried beneath tons of snow. But as he looked around at the vast expanse of chunked and settled debris that now covered nearly 10 acres of mountainside, his heart sank into despair. Where were his friends? The silence was deafening. No voices, no movement, nothing but the gentle whisper of wind across the debris and the sound of his own panicked breathing. Somewhere beneath the snow that surrounded him, his 4 best friends were buried, possibly injured, possibly dying, possibly already dead. "Connor!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and guilt. "Marcus! Danny! Tyler! Can anybody hear me?" Only his own echo answered back from the surrounding peaks, mocking him with its emptiness. 15 feet beneath the surface of the debris field, Connor Walsh was fighting the most desperate battle of his life. The avalanche had tumbled him like a leaf in a hurricane, spinning and crushing him through a chaos of snow and ice, before finally coming to rest in what had become his frozen tomb. The violence of the slide had left him battered and broken. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, almost certainly fractured, and blood trickled from a deep gash on his forehead where a chunk of ice had struck him during the terrifying descent. But the physical injuries were nothing compared to the psychological terror that threatened to consume him. The silence was absolute and crushing, a weight that seemed heavier than the tons of snow that imprisoned him. No light penetrated his frozen prison. The darkness was complete and suffocating. When he tried to move, the snow around him had compressed and hardened like concrete, allowing only the tiniest movements of his fingers and toes. His world had shrunk to a space barely larger than a coffin, and every breath used precious oxygen from the small air pocket that had somehow formed around his face when the slide finally stopped. Connor had taken an avalanche safety course just 2 years earlier, part of his preparation for serious backcountry riding. He knew the statistics that were now his grim reality. 15 minutes was the critical threshold for avalanche survival. In the first 15 minutes, about 90% of completely buried victims could be rescued alive if they weren't fatally injured. After that, survival rates dropped dramatically as hypothermia and asphyxiation claimed their victims. His watch, somehow still working despite the violence of the slide, showed 10:47 a.m. The avalanche had struck at 10:43. He had been buried for 4 minutes. Somewhere above him, separated by what felt like miles of compacted snow but was probably only 15 feet, he could faintly hear Jake's desperate calls. The sound was muffled and distorted, like voices heard through water, but it gave him a fragile thread of hope to cling to. At least one of them had survived on the surface. Maybe Jake could dig him out, or maybe help was already on the way. Connor tried to calm his breathing, forcing himself to take slow, measured breaths despite the panic that clawed at his chest. He knew that hyperventilation would only consume his limited oxygen faster, and panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He attempted to create more space around his chest by pushing against the snow with his good arm, but it was like trying to move granite. The snow had been compressed by tremendous pressure and had already begun to refreeze in the sub-zero temperature. His broken arm sent waves of agony through his body with every tiny movement, but he forced himself to keep trying. The cold was becoming unbearable with frightening speed. Snow had gotten inside his jacket during the violent tumble down the mountain, and his body heat was rapidly melting it into ice water that soaked his base layers and began the deadly process of heat loss. His fingers and toes were already going numb, despite his high-quality insulated gloves and boots. Hypothermia was setting in, and Connor knew it would race to claim his life even faster than suffocation. His mind began to wander as the cold and oxygen deprivation affected his consciousness. He thought about his family back in Denver, his parents who had always worried about his love for extreme sports, his younger sister Emma who looked up to him and called him her adventure hero, his girlfriend Sarah who had begged him not to go into the backcountry without a certified guide. They probably didn't even know yet that he was fighting for his life in a frozen grave high in the Colorado Rockies. Sarah was probably at her yoga class right now, expecting him to text her photos of powder runs and mountain views. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had moved to Colorado specifically for adventures like this. He had left a secure software job in California, given up a comfortable life in San Francisco, all to chase powder and experience the kind of freedom that only the mountains could provide. Now those same mountains were trying to claim his life, and he was helpless to fight back. Somewhere in the distance, muffled by snow and distance, Connor heard a new sound that made his heart leap with desperate hope, the rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the thin mountain air. The distinctive sound grew louder, then seemed to hover nearby before fading slightly. The mountain rescue team was coming, but would they find him in time? His watch now read 10:51 a.m., 8 minutes buried, 7 minutes until the critical 15-minute mark that separated the living from the dead. Connor closed his eyes and tried to conserve his energy, his breath, his life itself, while somewhere above him, professional rescuers were beginning their own desperate race against time. The radio crackled to life in the Aspen Mountain Rescue Headquarters at exactly 10:46 a.m., cutting through the quiet morning routine like a lightning bolt. Base, this is Jake Martinez on Buttermilk's North Face backcountry. We've had a massive avalanche with multiple burials. I'm on the surface, but 4 of my friends are completely buried. We need immediate rescue response. This is not a drill. Team leader Mike Chen was filling out paperwork when the call came in, but he dropped everything without hesitation. At 38, he had been with Mountain Rescue for 12 years and had responded to over 200 emergency calls in every conceivable mountain condition. But avalanche rescues never got easier. They were always a race against time, where every decision, every second of delay could mean the difference between pulling someone out alive or recovering a body. "Launch the bird!" Mike ordered into his radio as he ran toward the equipment room, his boots echoing off the concrete floor. "Full avalanche response. Get Saxon in the air and tell him to push it hard. We've got multiple burials and the clock is already running." Within 30 seconds, the building was alive with activity as the rescue team mobilized with the efficiency that comes from years of training and real-world experience. The team's Bell 407 helicopter was already spinning up on the helipad, its rotors throwing snow in every direction as pilot Jim Saxon ran through his abbreviated pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. Saxon was a former military pilot who had flown medevac missions in Afghanistan before coming to civilian mountain rescue. He knew that in situations like this, speed was more important than comfort, and he would push his aircraft to its absolute limits to get the rescue team to the scene. Mike's gear bag was always packed and ready: avalanche transceivers, lightweight probe poles, specialized shovels designed for snow rescue, medical equipment, emergency shelter, and communication gear. But the most important member of his rescue team was already bounding toward the helicopter with excitement and purpose. Ranger, a 4-year-old German shepherd who had been training for avalanche rescue since he was 8 weeks old. Ranger wore a bright red vest marked Search and Rescue and carried specialized gear designed specifically for avalanche work. The dog had been trained to detect human scent beneath snow at depths of up to 20 feet, and his success rate in finding buried victims was remarkable. In training exercises, Ranger could locate a buried person in minutes when it might take human searchers hours. More importantly, the dog had never given a false indication. When Ranger said someone was buried in a specific spot, Mike could trust that assessment completely. The helicopter lifted off at 10:49 a.m., just 3 minutes after Jake's initial distress call. Saxon pushed the aircraft hard, racing across the Aspen Valley toward the avalanche site at maximum speed. The flight time would normally be 12 minutes, but Saxon was determined to cut that to 8 or 9 by taking a more direct route through the mountain passes. In the cabin, Mike and his 3-person rescue team conducted their final equipment checks while Saxon updated them on conditions. "What's the temperature up there?" Mike asked through the intercom as they climbed rapidly toward the slide zone. "-8 Fahrenheit with 15-knot winds gusting to 25, Saxon replied, his voice tense with concentration as he navigated between mountain peaks that rose on both sides of the aircraft. "Visibility is good right now, but there's weather moving in from the west. We've got maybe an hour before conditions start to deteriorate." Through the helicopter's windows, Mike could see the avalanche debris field spreading across the mountainside like a war zone. The slide had been massive, easily 300 yards wide and over half a mile long, covering nearly 10 acres of mountainside with chunked and broken snow. Debris from the slide path was scattered everywhere: broken trees, exposed rocks, and irregular mounds of compressed snow that could hide buried victims anywhere within the vast area. Finding 4 buried people in all that chaos would be like searching for needles in a haystack, except that these needles were dying with every passing minute. The mathematics of avalanche rescue were brutal and unforgiving. For every minute that passed, the chances of survival dropped measurably. After 15 minutes, survival rates plummeted. After 30 minutes, recoveries were more common than rescues. At 10:52 a.m., Saxon set the helicopter down on a relatively flat area just below the debris field, the aircraft's skids settling into knee-deep snow. The rescue team poured out immediately, Ranger bounding ahead with his nose already working to pick up scent traces carried on the mountain wind. The dog's energy and enthusiasm were infectious. This was what he had been born and trained to do, and he approached the task with the joy and focus that only a working dog could display. Mike could see Jake waving frantically from about 200 yards up the slope, still partially buried, but alive and mobile. The sight of the survivor gave Mike hope. If Jake had made it through the slide, there was a chance others had too. But he also knew that surface survivals didn't guarantee anything about the people who had been completely buried. "Jake!" Mike shouted as he approached, his voice barely audible over the wind that was picking up strength. "How many buried, and where were they when the slide hit? I need exact positions." Every second of information gathering was crucial. The more they knew about burial locations and the sequence of events, the better their chances of conducting an efficient search. "4 people completely buried!" Jake yelled back, his face pale with cold and fear, ice crystals forming in his beard from his panicked breathing. Connor was up there near the crown when it released. Marcus and Danny were in the middle section riding together. Tyler was furthest down when the slide caught him. He pointed to different areas of the massive debris field, his hands shaking from cold and shock. Mike looked at his watch. 10:53 a.m., 10 minutes since the burial. They were still within the critical window, but time was running out fast. The real race was just beginning, and the mountain rescue team was about to test their skills, their training, and their determination against the mountain itself. Ranger moved across the debris field with the focused intensity that separated professional search and rescue dogs from ordinary pets. His black nose swept back and forth just inches above the snow surface, analyzing thousands of scent molecules carried on the mountain wind. The German shepherd's breathing created small clouds of vapor in the frigid air as he worked methodically across the terrain, his red rescue vest standing out like a beacon against the white landscape. The dog had been trained to recognize the specific scent signature of humans in distress, a combination of sweat, fear, and the unique odor that people emit when buried and fighting for their lives. Unlike human searchers who relied on electronic equipment and visual cues, Ranger could detect victims buried far deeper than any Avalanche transceiver could reach, following scent trails that were invisible to human senses. Mike followed 20 feet behind the dog, his Avalanche transceiver beeping slowly as it searched for signals from the buried victims' emergency beacons. The electronic device was crucial for pinpointing exact locations, but it had limitations. The transceivers only worked within a certain range, and signals could be blocked or distorted by the dense, compressed snow. Ranger's nose, however, was far more sensitive and reliable than any machine ever built. The other team members, Sarah Kim, an emergency medical technician with specialized mountain rescue training, and Rodriguez, a technical rescue specialist with 15 years of experience, spread out across the debris field in a coordinated search pattern. Each rescuer focused on a different section of the massive slide zone, systematically covering ground while staying in radio contact. "Come on, Ranger," Mike whispered under his breath, watching the dog's body language for any sign of interest. "Find them, boy. Find them for us." The clock was their enemy now, ticking away precious seconds that could mean the difference between life and death for the 4 people buried somewhere beneath their feet. Mike's watch showed 10:56 a.m., 13 minutes since the burial. In just 2 more minutes, they would cross the critical 15-minute threshold where survival rates began their steep decline. His team had found people alive after longer burials, but the statistics were grim, and everyone knew it. Every Avalanche rescue was ultimately a gamble against time, physics, and human physiology. Suddenly, Ranger's behavior changed dramatically. His head snapped up, nostrils flaring as he caught something specific on the wind. The dog's entire posture shifted from methodical searching to focused hunting. His tail went rigid, his ears pricked forward, and he began moving with purpose toward the upper portion of the debris field where the Avalanche had first released its deadly cargo. Mike felt his heart rate spike as he recognized the behavior pattern he had seen hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in real rescues. This wasn't casual interest or a false lead. Ranger had detected human scent, and he was locked onto it with laser focus. The dog began moving faster, weaving between chunks of Avalanche debris as he followed the scent trail. His nose worked constantly, sampling the air and making subtle adjustments to his path as he triangulated on the source. Mike followed as quickly as he could, his heavy boots sometimes breaking through the crusty surface of the debris and plunging him knee-deep into softer snow below. Then Ranger stopped abruptly at a spot that looked completely unremarkable to human eyes, just another section of the chunked and settled debris that covered acres of mountainside. But to the dog's incredible nose, this location was screaming with human scent, rising through microscopic gaps in the snow from a victim buried somewhere below. Ranger began digging frantically, his powerful paws throwing snow in every direction. His digging wasn't random or excited, it was focused and purposeful, the behavior of a working dog who knew exactly what he was doing. Every movement was deliberate, every scoop of snow calculated to bring him closer to the source of the scent. "Signal here!" Mike shouted across the debris field, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Ranger's got a strong indication. All units converge on my position." The other rescuers immediately abandoned their search areas and began running toward Mike's location, bringing their probe poles and shovels. Mike's transceiver was now beeping more rapidly as he approached the spot where Ranger was digging, indicating they were close to one of the buried emergency beacons. The electronic signal confirmed what the dog's nose had already told them. Someone was buried beneath this unremarkable patch of snow, fighting for their life in a frozen tomb. "Ranger, show me!" Mike commanded, and the dog barked once, sharp, clear, and unmistakable. It was the signal Mike had been waiting for, the sound that told him his four-legged partner had made a definitive find. In all his years of training and fieldwork, he had never seen Ranger give a false indication. When the dog said someone was here, someone was here. The team converged on the location and began probing immediately, pushing their lightweight aluminum poles deep into the snow to feel for the soft resistance that indicated a human body rather than rocks, ice, or debris. The probing was systematic and urgent. They needed to pinpoint the exact location of the victim before beginning the excavation that would determine whether they were conducting a rescue or a recovery. On his third probe, Mike felt something that made his pulse race, the unmistakable give of clothing and flesh beneath the compressed snow. The resistance was different from rock or ice, softer and more yielding. There was definitely a person buried here, but were they still alive after 13 minutes in their frozen prison? "Contact!" Mike yelled, his voice cutting through the mountain air like a blade. "We've got someone here! Start digging now!" The team attacked the snow with their specialized shovels, working with the desperate efficiency that comes from knowing that every second counted. The shovels bit into the compacted snow with metallic scrapes that echoed across the mountainside like the sound of picks against stone. Mike's team worked with the surgical precision of a trauma unit, each member knowing their role without needing direction or coordination. Snow flew in every direction as they excavated straight down toward the probe contact, creating a funnel-shaped hole in the debris that grew deeper with each desperate scoop. The work was backbreaking. At this altitude, every breath was a struggle in the thin mountain air, and the physical exertion of moving compressed snow was pushing each rescuer to their limits. But they couldn't afford to slow down. Somewhere beneath their shovels, a human being was fighting for life in conditions that would kill most people in minutes. 2 feet down, called out Sarah Kim, sweat freezing on her face despite the sub-zero temperature that was making her breath visible in sharp puffs of vapor. Still feeling soft contact with the probe, definitely human, definitely in this location. The snow at this depth was like concrete, compressed by the tremendous forces of the avalanche into a substance harder than most people could imagine. Each shovelful required maximum effort, and the repetitive motion was taking its toll on muscles and joints. Mike checked his watch again. 11:01 a.m., 18 minutes since burial. They were now well beyond the critical 15-minute window, venturing into territory where survival became increasingly unlikely with each passing minute. But he had seen miracles before. People surviving in air pockets for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, even longer. Others didn't make it past 10 minutes. There was no way to predict human survival until they reached the person buried beneath them and checked for vital signs. Ranger continued to pace around the dig site, occasionally barking to reinforce his find and maintain the team's focus. The dog's behavior was telling Mike they were in exactly the right place, but the question now was whether they would be digging up a survivor or beginning the heartbreaking process of body recovery. 3 feet down, Sarah announced, her voice strained from exertion but maintaining the professional calm that came from years of emergency medical training. Probe contact is getting stronger. We're definitely close now. The other team members continued to shovel with mechanical precision, their movements becoming more careful as they approached their target. Accidental injury from a shovel strike could kill someone who had survived the avalanche itself. The irony of causing fatal trauma during a rescue was every rescuer's nightmare. Jake stood at the edge of the dig site, his face a mask of anguish as he watched the rescue unfold. These were his friends buried in the snow, people he had invited on this backcountry adventure, people who had trusted his judgment when he chose this particular slope. The guilt was eating him alive, a psychological weight that felt heavier than the physical exhaustion of his own ordeal. But he forced himself to stay and help however he could, knowing that his friends needed every available hand if they were going to survive. 4 feet down, called out Rodriguez, as his shovel struck something that felt different from the compressed snow they had been moving. I've got fabric here, bright red fabric. The pace of digging intensified immediately, but the movements became even more precise. They were no longer simply excavating snow. They were performing surgery with shovels, trying to free a human being from their frozen prison without causing additional harm. Easy now, Mike cautioned, as they began to expose more of the buried person's jacket. Watch for airways and breathing space. We don't know how they're positioned down there, and we can't afford to collapse any air pocket that might be keeping them alive. The last thing they wanted was to accidentally destroy the very thing that had allowed their victim to survive this long. More red fabric appeared as they carefully cleared snow from around what appeared to be a shoulder and upper torso. The fabric was completely motionless, no sign of breathing, no response to their voices calling down into the excavation. For a terrifying moment, Mike wondered if they were too late, if they were uncovering a body rather than saving a life. "Got an arm!" Rodriguez shouted, exposing a sleeve with a hand still wearing a black ski glove. The hand was pale and motionless, the fingers slightly curled in a way that could indicate either unconsciousness or death. Mike immediately checked for a pulse, pressing his own gloved fingers against the victim's wrist through the fabric of the glove. His own heart was pounding so hard from exertion and adrenaline that he could barely feel anything through his thick rescue gloves. But there, faint but unmistakable, was a weak and irregular pulse in the victim's wrist. The rhythm was slow and thready, probably indicating severe hypothermia, but it was definitely a heartbeat. "He's alive!" Mike yelled, his voice cracking with emotion and relief. "We've got a live one here. Keep digging, but be extremely careful around the head and airway." The team's energy doubled as they worked to expose more of the buried snowboarder, their movements now fueled by the knowledge that they were conducting a rescue rather than a recovery. If this story has you hooked so far, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you would do in their place. Because what comes next is even more intense. The pale hand that emerged from the snow was like a beacon of hope, piercing through the despair that had threatened to overwhelm the rescue team. Mike carefully cleared additional snow from around Connor's wrist, feeling again for the pulse that confirmed life still flickered within the buried snowboarder. It was weak and irregular, the kind of heartbeat that indicated a body pushed to the very edge of survival. But it was unmistakably there. "Talk to me, Connor!" Mike called down into the excavation as his team continued the delicate process of freeing the buried victim. "Can you hear me up there? We're getting you out. Stay with us." There was no response from the motionless figure, but Mike hadn't expected one. After 18 minutes of burial in sub-zero conditions, most victims who were still alive were unconscious from oxygen deprivation, hypothermia, or both. Sarah worked methodically to expose Connor's upper body, using her hands instead of her shovel to brush away snow from around his face and chest. What she found was both encouraging and terrifying. Connor had ended up in a partially upright position against a large chunk of avalanche debris, and this positioning had created a small air pocket around his head and upper torso. This pocket, probably no larger than a basketball, had been the difference between life and death, providing just enough airspace to keep him breathing through the long minutes of burial. But Connor's condition was critical. His face was blue with cold, his lips nearly purple, and his breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible even when Sarah put her ear close to his mouth. Ice crystals had formed on his eyebrows and in his hair, and his skin had the waxy appearance that indicated severe hypothermia. "Airway is clear, but he's severely hypothermic," Sarah reported, her emergency medical training taking over as she began a rapid assessment of Connor's condition. "Breathing is extremely shallow, pulse is weak and irregular. Core body temperature is probably in the danger zone. We need to get him warm and get him off this mountain immediately." Mike keyed his radio while continuing to help with the excavation. "Base, this is Mountain Rescue Team 1. We have one victim recovered, alive but critical. Prep the helicopter for immediate medical evacuation. Patient is severely hypothermic and will need aggressive warming protocols." Even as he spoke, he was thinking about the 3 other people still buried somewhere in this vast debris field. They had found one, but time was running out for the others at an exponential rate. As they freed more of Connor's body from its frozen prison, the full extent of his injuries became apparent. His left arm was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle that made Sarah wince when she saw it. His ski jacket was torn in several places from the violence of the avalanche, and dried blood had frozen on his face from what appeared to be a significant head wound. But he was breathing, his heart was beating, and he was alive. "Got his legs free?" Rodriguez called out as he carefully shoveled around Connor's lower body, checking for additional injuries. "Left leg might be injured too, but nothing obviously broken down here. No obvious spinal trauma, but we'll need to immobilize him before moving. They would need to treat Connor as a potential spinal injury case until they could get him to a hospital for proper evaluation." The helicopter rotors were already spinning up on the landing zone below as Saxon prepared for the medical evacuation flight that would take Connor to Aspen Valley Medical Center. But Mike faced an agonizing decision that every rescue leader dreaded. Transport this victim immediately to save his life, or continue searching for the others while they still might be alive. The mathematics were brutal. If they loaded Connor onto the helicopter now, they would lose valuable search time while the aircraft flew to the hospital and returned. But if they delayed his evacuation to continue searching, they might lose Connor to hypothermia while trying to save people who might already be dead. "Jake," Mike called out to the survivor who was still helping at the edge of the dig site, "I need you to give me exact positions again. Where were your other friends when the avalanche hit? Every detail you can remember." They needed more information to focus their search efforts and make the most of their remaining time. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to relive those terrifying final seconds before the mountains swallowed his friends. "Marcus was maybe 100 yards downslope from Connor's position," he said, pointing to an area in the middle section of the debris field. "He was riding with Danny. They were close together, maybe 30 feet apart when the slide hit them. Tyler was furthest down, near the bottom of the slope when everything went to hell." Mike looked at his watch. 11:05 a.m. 22 minutes since the burial. The statistics said the others were probably dead by now, but statistics didn't account for luck, air pockets, or the sheer human will to survive. As long as there was any chance, any possibility that someone was still fighting for life beneath the snow, the mountain rescue team would keep searching. "Sarah, get Connor stabilized for transport," Mike ordered, making the decision that would haunt him regardless of the outcome. "Rodriguez, you and Jake move to the middle section where Marcus and Danny were last seen. I'm taking Ranger to work the downslope area where Tyler went down." They were splitting their resources, gambling that they could find and rescue multiple victims simultaneously. Connor was carefully lifted from his frozen tomb and placed on a rescue sled, his broken arm immobilized and his body wrapped in emergency warming blankets. As the helicopter prepared to take him to medical care, Mike could only hope they would find the others in time to fill the remaining seats on the aircraft with survivors rather than bodies. The wind picked up dramatically as the rescue team prepared to split their efforts between evacuating Connor and continuing the desperate search for the remaining victims. What had started as a crisp, clear morning was rapidly deteriorating into the kind of mountain weather that could turn a rescue operation into a survival situation for the rescuers themselves. Mike's face was completely numb with cold, despite his insulated balaclava, and ice had formed on his goggles from his breath, forcing him to constantly clear his vision. The temperature was dropping as thick clouds began to obscure the sun, and the wind was now gusting strong enough to blow loose snow across the debris field, potentially burying any surface clues even deeper. Mike knew they were running out of time on multiple fronts. Not just the survival window for the buried victims, but also the weather window that would allow them to continue working safely on the mountain. "Sarah, get Connor ready for immediate transport," Mike ordered, pulling off his outer gloves to check his Avalanche transceiver more precisely. The electronic device was picking up multiple signals now, indicating they were getting closer to the other buried victims' emergency beacons. "Rodriguez, you and Jake move to the middle section where Marcus and Danny were last seen. Work together and call out immediately if you get any kind of contact." The German Shepherd was showing signs of fatigue after the intense search work, his breathing labored in the thin mountain air and ice beginning to form on his whiskers and around his eyes. But Ranger's nose was still working efficiently as Mike guided him toward the downslope area where Tyler had been swept by the avalanche's final, devastating surge. As Rodriguez and Jake moved across the debris field toward their assigned search area, Jake stumbled and fell hard to his knees in the snow. The emotional and physical toll of the morning was finally catching up with him. He had been partially buried himself, had watched his best friends disappear beneath tons of moving snow, and was now helping search for what might be their bodies. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the first hour was fading, leaving behind exhaustion, hypothermia, and crushing psychological trauma. "I can't do this anymore," Jake gasped, his breath coming in sharp, painful puffs of vapor that immediately froze in the frigid air. "This is all my fault. I'm the one who brought them up here. I chose this slope. I should have known it was dangerous." The guilt was overwhelming, threatening to paralyze him just when the rescue team needed all the help they could get. Rodriguez stopped immediately and grabbed Jake by the shoulders, forcing the traumatized snowboarder to look him in the eyes. At 42, Rodriguez had seen this kind of survivor guilt dozens of times in mountain rescue situations. "Listen to me very carefully," he said firmly, his voice cutting through Jake's panic. "Right now, this minute, your friends need you to push through this. The guilt, the blame, the what-ifs, all of that comes later. Right now, we search. Right now, we save lives." The words cut through Jake's emotional spiral, focusing him back on the immediate task. Rodriguez was right. There would be time for guilt and recrimination later. Right now, Marcus, Danny, and Tyler were somewhere beneath the snow, and every minute of delay reduced their chances of survival. Meanwhile, Mike was working with Ranger in increasingly difficult conditions. The falling snow was beginning to accumulate on the debris field, and the wind was swirling scent in unpredictable patterns that made the dog's job exponentially harder. Ranger was trying his best, moving methodically across the search area, but Mike could see the animal's energy flagging after over an hour of intense work in brutal conditions. Suddenly, Mike's transceiver began beeping more rapidly, the electronic tone indicating they were approaching one of the remaining Avalanche beacons. "Signal here," he shouted into his radio, and Ranger immediately moved to investigate the area. But this time, the dog's behavior was different, less certain, more confused by the conflicting scents carried on the swirling wind. Mike began probing with his aluminum pole, pushing it deep into the snow in a systematic grid pattern around the strongest beacon signal. The probe work was methodical but urgent, They needed to determine whether they had found a victim or just a piece of equipment separated from its owner by the avalanche's violence. On his seventh probe, Mike felt something solid but wrong. Too hard and smooth to be a human body, too regular to be a rock or natural debris. As he probed further around the contact, he realized with growing dread that he had found a snowboard, probably torn away from one of the victims during the chaotic tumble down the mountain. The beacon signal was coming from the snowboard's binding system, where Tyler's Avalanche transceiver had been securely attached according to standard safety protocols. But where was Tyler himself? The Avalanche's tremendous forces could separate people from their equipment in seconds, carrying bodies and gear in completely different directions across the debris field. Mike felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain weather. Finding equipment without the person who had been wearing it was often a sign that the victim had been subjected to forces violent enough to cause fatal trauma. But he couldn't give up hope. Not yet. Not while there was still any chance of life. "Rodriguez, what's your status?" Mike called over the radio as he continued searching around Tyler's snowboard. "We've got multiple beacon signals in the middle section," came the reply, crackling with static through the mountain air. "Working on probe contacts now. Jake is holding up better. We might have something here." Mike looked at his watch. 11:12 a.m. 29 minutes since the burial. Even if they found someone now, the chances of survival were becoming vanishingly small. But the mountain rescue team never gave up. As long as there was any possibility of life, they would keep digging, keep searching, keep fighting against time and the mountain itself. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was becoming a serious factor in their ability to work safely. Mike knew they might have to make the agonizing decision to suspend the search if conditions deteriorated much further, but not yet. Not while there was still hope. The sound that saved Marcus Chen's life was almost too faint to register in his fading consciousness. The distant bark of a rescue dog carried on the mountain wind like a voice from another world. Buried nearly 4 feet beneath the snow for close to 30 minutes, Marcus had been drifting in and out of awareness as his body slowly shut down from cold and oxygen deprivation. His world had shrunk to a space smaller than a coffin, filled with his own expelled breath that was gradually using up the tiny amount of oxygen in his frozen prison. But something about that bark, muffled and distorted as it was by tons of snow, penetrated the fog that was clouding his mind and sparked a desperate primal will to live. Drawing on reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, Marcus managed to move his right hand just inches through the compacted snow around him, scraping weakly at the walls of his tomb. The movement was tiny, barely perceptible, but it was enough to create a small vibration that Rodriguez felt through his probe pole as he systematically searched the middle section of the debris field. "Contact!" Rodriguez shouted, his voice cutting through the wind with renewed energy. "I've got movement here. Someone's alive down there." The discovery energized both him and Jake, who rushed to the position despite his own exhaustion and the psychological trauma that threatened to overwhelm him. Jake dropped to his knees beside the probe contact, pressing his ear to the snow despite the cold that immediately began burning his skin. "Marcus!" he called down into the debris. "Marcus, can you hear me? We're digging you out." There was no audible response, but Jake could swear he felt the faintest vibration through the compressed snow. Someone trying to move, trying to signal, trying to live. Meanwhile, Mike and Ranger had moved to yet another section of the debris field, still searching for the remaining victims in conditions that were becoming more dangerous by the minute. The dog's behavior suddenly changed again, his head snapping up with renewed interest despite his obvious fatigue. Ranger had caught something on the wind, another scent trace that triggered his training and instincts. "What is it, boy?" Mike asked, watching the dog's body language carefully. Ranger barked once and began digging at a spot that looked identical to dozens of others they had searched. But Mike had learned to trust his four-legged partner completely, and he began probing immediately around the dog's indication. Within minutes, Mike felt the soft resistance that every rescue worker both hopes for and dreads. Human contact beneath the snow. "Got another one!" he yelled across the debris field, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Two more contacts. We need all available hands on both dig sites." The race was now against complete physiological collapse as they fought to reach victims who had been buried for over 30 minutes. At this point, they were working in territory where survival was unlikely but not impossible, the realm of miracles and air pockets and the incredible human capacity to endure beyond all reasonable expectations. The digging at both sites was brutal work in the deteriorating weather conditions. Snow continued to fall steadily, and the wind was now gusting strong enough to blow excavated snow back into their holes, forcing them to constantly re-dig the same areas. Mike's hands were completely numb, despite his insulated gloves, and his back ached from the constant shoveling, but he pushed harder with each passing minute. At Rodriguez's dig site, they reached Marcus first. When Jake saw his friend's pale, blue-tinged face emerge from the snow, he almost collapsed with relief and emotional exhaustion. Marcus was unconscious and barely breathing, his body temperature dangerously low and his pulse weak and irregular, but the spark of life was unmistakably there. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Jake called out as Rodriguez and Sarah, who had returned from Connor's evacuation, began emergency medical care. Marcus's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused and confused, pupils dilated from cold and oxygen deprivation. But it was the most beautiful sight Jake had ever seen, proof that his friend was still fighting, still alive after an ordeal that should have killed him. At Mike's dig site, they reached Danny Peterson just minutes later. Like the others, he was hypothermic and barely conscious, but somehow still alive after his nightmare beneath the snow. The avalanche had positioned him in a slight natural depression that had provided just enough airspace to keep him breathing through the long burial. 3 victims recovered, 3 lives pulled back from the edge of death. But there was still one person unaccounted for, Tyler Morrison, who had been swept furthest down the debris field and remained buried somewhere in the vast expanse of avalanche debris. Mike looked at his watch. 11:18 a.m. 35 minutes since the burial. The medical helicopter was already loading Marcus and Danny for transport to the Valley Hospital, where Connor was already receiving emergency treatment for severe hypothermia and his broken bones. But Tyler was still out there, somewhere beneath the snow, and Mike knew they couldn't stop searching until they found him. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and Mike could see concern in Saxon's eyes as the pilot prepared for another dangerous flight down the mountain. But there was still one more life to save, one more person fighting for survival in a frozen tomb. The mountain rescue team would not leave anyone behind. The helicopter rotors created a whirlwind of snow and ice as Saxon lifted off with Marcus and Danny, the aircraft's engines straining against the deteriorating weather conditions. Both rescued victims were alive but critical, their body temperatures hovering in the danger zone, where cardiac arrest could occur at any moment. As the aircraft disappeared over the mountain peaks toward Aspen Valley Medical Center, where Connor was already receiving aggressive warming treatment, Mike and his remaining team members continued their desperate search for Tyler. The weather had become a serious enemy. What had started as light snow was now a steady snowfall that reduced visibility and made every movement on the debris field treacherous. The wind was gusting to over 30 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that pushed the effective temperature well below zero. Mike knew they were approaching the limits of safe operation, But he couldn't abandon the search while there was still any chance that Tyler was alive. Ranger was exhausted, but still working, his black nose sweeping across the lower section of the debris field where Tyler had last been seen before the avalanche swept him away. The dog's breathing was labored in the thin mountain air, and ice had formed on his whiskers and around his eyes, but his training and dedication drove him forward. This was what he had been born to do, and he would not quit until his handler called him off. Jake stumbled alongside the rescue team, his own endurance pushed far beyond normal limits. The guilt and fear had been replaced by a grim determination to find his last missing friend. Tyler was 26 years old, a recent law school graduate who had moved to Colorado specifically for adventures like this backcountry snowboarding trip. He had to be somewhere in the debris field. The alternative was unthinkable. At 11:23 a.m., 40 minutes after the burial, Ranger's behavior changed one final time. The dog moved with sudden purpose toward an area where the avalanche debris was particularly deep and chaotic, where large chunks of ice and broken trees were scattered across the landscape like the aftermath of a battle between giants. This section looked like a war zone carved from snow and stone, nearly impossible terrain for any kind of systematic search. "He's got something," Mike called out, following Ranger toward a spot where the dog began digging with renewed energy, despite his obvious fatigue. Mike's transceiver was silent, no beacon signal from this location, but he had learned to trust his four-legged partner completely. If Ranger said someone was here, someone was here. The digging was the hardest yet. The snow in this area was mixed with ice chunks and debris from the massive trees the avalanche had destroyed in its path down the mountain. Each shovelful was heavy and difficult, and they had to be careful not to strike Tyler with their tools if he was buried beneath the chaos of ice and wood. 6 feet down and still digging, Mike reported into his radio as sweat froze on his face despite the sub-zero temperature. "Ranger is still indicating strong scent, but we're running out of safe operating time here." The weather was approaching the point where they would have to evacuate or risk becoming victims themselves. Rodriguez worked alongside Mike, both men pushing their bodies to the absolute limit in the race against time and the elements. 43 minutes of burial was far beyond any reasonable hope of survival, but Mike had seen miracles before. People had survived longer in avalanches when conditions were just right, when air pockets formed, when body position created breathing space, when sheer will to live overcame impossible odds. Then Jake's shovel struck something that felt different from the ice and debris they had been excavating. "I've got something," he yelled, dropping to his knees to clear snow and ice with his hands. A section of Tyler's distinctive blue jacket became visible, then his shoulder, then finally his face. Pale as marble, but somehow still achingly human in the mountain sunlight that was struggling to penetrate the falling snow. Mike immediately checked for vital signs, not expecting to find any after such a long burial. But as he pressed his fingers against Tyler's throat, searching for a pulse that probably wasn't there, he felt something that made him gasp with amazement. A heartbeat. Weak, irregular, barely there, but unmistakably alive. "He's breathing," Mike shouted as they carefully extracted Tyler from his frozen prison. "How is this possible?" The answer became clear as they freed more of Tyler's body from the debris. The avalanche had swept him into a natural depression between two large boulders, creating an air pocket that had kept him alive through the longest burial any of them had ever seen. The space was tiny, barely large enough for Tyler's head and upper body, but it had been enough. Tyler's eyes opened as they lifted him from the snow, unfocused and confused but aware. His lips were blue with cold, his face was pale as death, but he was conscious and trying to speak. "Jake," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "What happened? Where am I?" "You're safe," Jake replied, tears freezing on his cheeks as he looked down at his friend. "You're safe now. We got you out." As the helicopter arrived for the final evacuation, Mike stood looking out across the debris field where they had fought their battle against time and nature itself. 4 people had been buried by the avalanche, and 4 people were flying off the mountain alive. It was a victory against odds that should have been impossible, a testament to training, teamwork, courage, and a little bit of miracle. Ranger sat beside him, panting heavily but alert, his red rescue vest a proud banner against the white landscape. The dog had found every victim, leading the team to 4 lives that would have been lost without his incredible nose and unwavering determination. In a world where natural disasters could strike without warning, there were still people and animals willing to risk everything to save lives. The mountain had shown its power that morning, demonstrating the awesome and terrifying forces that shaped the high country. But it had not won. Human courage, professional training, teamwork forged through years of practice, and the bond between rescuer and rescue dog had prevailed against impossible odds. Connor, Marcus, Danny, and Tyler would all recover from their ordeal, though each would carry the memory of those minutes beneath the snow for the rest of their lives. They had looked death in the face and survived, pulled back to life by people who understood that courage isn't a choice, it's a calling. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories of courage and sacrifice happen every day in the mountains and valleys of America, where brave men and women stand ready to risk their own lives to save others. The next mission might be closer than you think, and the next time someone's life hangs in the balance, heroes like Mike Chen and his team will answer the call.